welcome everybody. As always, super pumped that people even show up. It's not a given, especially these days. Everybody's busy in school or in this period anyway. So thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to us. It's an honor to us to have you. I think all of you have been here in the past sessions at some point, but if you need a bathroom, it's just outside the door. Women's bathroom, just straight out the door. Men's is just in the hallway there. Then secondly, yes?
I think this gents is still out of order, so you'd have to use the one upstairs.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
yes.
for a while. I haven't looked since I come in, but it was out of order on Sunday. So.
Okay. So upstairs is easy to find as well. You just go up the stairs, and there's a similar hallway to this one, and you'll see the bathrooms. To the left is the men's, and to the right is the women's bathroom. So there's that. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for pointing that out. Then the usual. We want this to be a safe place in many ways. One, we ask you to wear your mask at all times. Thank you for doing that. It's a nuisance, but at this point we almost get used to it. It always grows onto our face, so that's what it feels like anyway. So take it with a grain of humor anyway. Then, secondly, as always, we want this to be a safe space for discussion as well. So if we have different opinions, if we have disagreements, those are very much welcome. Also to be voiced and to be discussed. It's not something. That's why we're here, basically. To learn, and learning happens more often when there is some kind of disagreement and when something needs to be fleshed out. So please feel welcome to do that and give each other the grace to disagree. And that being said, let's get started for today. A bit of a disclaimer here in the beginning. You may have seen the title for today as the Greco-Roman worldview and its impact on the Bible. And as this Bible course progresses, develops, so does the content in a way as well. And at least for me, some priorities have shifted a little bit. So I've actually decided not to spend a whole lot of time on the Greco-Roman stuff. Not that it isn't important, but I think something else has grown in importance for myself. So instead, the vast majority of the night we're going to actually spend on Judaism and its impact on the Bible, and especially on the New Testament, and or especially on the time of and ministry of Jesus. So just to kind of paint a picture of what kind of world was Jesus born into. But if there's anybody here who was really looking forward to do some Greek or some Latin, sorry, we're not going to deep dive into that. One reason being that the Roman contribution to the Bible is fairly slim. Perhaps the main contribution would be the spreading of the gospel in terms of now there's an infrastructure, there's roads, there's a vast trading network that allows for news to spread much more quickly than it did just in the decades or centuries before the Romans took over basically the whole known world at the time. But that's kind of it. Other than that, their mentality or ideology has not really impacted the Jewish ideology in a very deep way. The Greeks is a little bit different. That would be worthwhile digging into eventually. But again, priorities have shifted a little bit. But in the Greeks, suffice to say, the Greek language became the primary language of the day as they took over the reins, basically in the entire area before the Romans did. They established Greek as the primary language throughout their empire. I'm not aware of any empire prior to that, like the Persians or Babylonians, that did that. They were not so keen on a universal language. But the Greeks, very much in their mindset of learning and education, standardized a language. And we can witness that firsthand in the Bible because all those old manuscripts are written, or not all of them, but most of them, especially the New Testament, is written in Greek rather than Hebrew, even though these people were Hebrews. So very much an influence there. And I'm not sure how much of a linguist you are, but you may, if you speak one or two or more languages, let's say, you would know that there's no exact translation between one language to the next. There's close words, but it's never 100%. And some concepts don't even translate at all. So we have to kind of make sentences to explain just a single word. And that same thing happens between Hebrew and Greek. Now, Greek was so prominent at that time that even the Hebrews, the Israelites, would translate their own scriptures into Greek. And that's called the Septuagint. You may have heard that word before. So that Septuagint, however, is not like we translate the Bible today. We translate the Bible today so that more and more cultures can read the Bible, which is an awesome thing. But the Jews are not, they don't have this missional mindset so much. To them, it's not an effort to make the Bible readable to other people as well. It was because a ton of Jews lost their Hebrew and spoke only Greek, especially if they lived throughout the Mediterranean, in Rome, in Greece itself, or in Alexandria in Egypt, where this was a hot spot for education. So lots of Jews actually lost their Hebrew and were only fluent, really familiar with Greek. So hence they translate the scriptures, but again, if translation is not 100%, then now new ideas are being formed. And now we start to think along slightly different patterns because the language now is slightly different. And that then segues into the second larger impact of the Greek onto the Hebrew, which is philosophy. Now, I'm not a big Greek philosopher or an expert in that, but I do believe Platonism had a pretty large impact in the entire region anyway, but particularly on the Jews as well. And that's this thinking that there's the distinction between the material and the spiritual, even in the person itself, that the soul and the body are now thought as distinct, and the spiritual is seen as better and higher, and the physical is perhaps even evil. It's for sure inferior. And that thinking, that philosophy has very much found its way into the Hebrew culture and into their writings, and perhaps to an extent in the New Testament as well. There's good stuff to uncover there. But instead, we're going to cover very quickly the history of Israel in very broad strokes. And then we're going to stop and hone in really at the time between the Testaments. Because that is a time that is oftentimes unknown to people because we are very familiar with the Bible, but the Bible doesn't really say much about this particular period of time. So, with that, finally the PowerPoint. Here we go. I love timelines. I'm a history geek, so you got to bear with me there. There's a lot of ways in which times or events in the Bible are dated. One of them being, for example, adding or subtracting somebody's age, and so on and so forth. That's one way. Or we can do it archaeologically and try to piece it together that way. So there's many. If you look up a biblical timeline, they will most likely all look different. They will roughly be the same, but there's going to be details in which they differ because they have different criteria on which they use to date things. So don't get hung up too much on the particular years or whatever. That's why I don't even include them. But just as a succession, what happens when? So first up, we have what's generally called the Primeval Period. This would be from creation or the dim past up to Abraham. There is zero material evidence for Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And that's also no surprise because if they live in tents, then those tents don't survive thousands of years, even in the dirt. So, and they wouldn't not necessarily have a sticker on them either. This was Abraham's tent or something. So we have no way to prove that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob historically existed apart from the claim in the Bible. That being said, there is what makes it plausible is that the setting in which they operate in the Bible, the customs that are described in that narrative, very much fit into this time period. If we consider the Babylonian background, very much it fits into that background. So it's believable in that sense. However, as a disclaimer, there are some places that are mentioned in Genesis, in those narratives, that weren't around at the time. They didn't exist yet. Nobody had settled there yet. So that makes people think that actually Genesis, or even the whole Pentateuch, was written much later. Not necessarily that these stories are untrue, but it's more like these stories have been passed on from generation to generation until later, at a later date, somebody writes them down, but happens to include places that are around at that time but weren't in the original story. So much to that. Next, we have the patriarchal period. Actually, yes, that is correct. So the patriarchal period is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the blue is before Abraham, the yellow is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So same story. There is no material evidence for this. Still very much the same customs, and there are no cities built at this point in Israel anyway, or Israel doesn't even exist as a people, so it's very hard to corroborate this. But this is, at least according to the Hebrews, this is their origin story, right? Then we have an important block, which is the slavery in Egypt. Now we start to see some kind of evidence. It's not clear that this is necessarily Israel, but as you remember perhaps from last week, there is evidence that there were immigrants into Egypt and then emigrants out of Egypt, so people leaving Egypt. And in some way, shape, or form, perhaps more or less dramatic. But that's now where we see, now we see some archaeological evidence that makes sense. Even though, again, there's no license plate that says, this was Joseph's. But generally, now archaeology starts to corroborate this origin story. Then we have the Exodus and the Conquest period. Basically, Israel wandering through the desert for about 40 years and then settling in the land for, depending on who you ask, about 100 to 200 years. And during that time, that's the time of the conquest and the judges as well. So there's not a centralized rule in Israel yet. It is the time of judges where kind of everybody does whatever they think is fit. Then we have the monarchy. Now we do have centralized rule. And now, beginning with this period, we don't just have some evidence, we have quite clear evidence that this is historical. There are historical, like the Bible very much now goes into a mode of telling not just a grand story, but much more in a what we call it, in a archive kind of way, where it's like, okay, this year this happened, that year that happened. So much more seriously telling history rather than story. But also outside the Bible, we have evidence Israel existed at this time and was a monarchy. Then the exile is surprisingly small. That is because the point in time, like there's one point in time basically when the Jews, at least the leading class in Jerusalem, are taken away into exile. So that's one moment, but then they trickle back. They don't go back all in one chunk. So the period where these people all were in Babylon was only about 40 to 50 years. After that, they already start to come back in at least 3 waves that we kind of know of. So the time of the return is actually longer than the exile itself. Or we could say the exile lasted for different amounts of time for different people. And this is kind of where the Old Testament stops. And our question marks may begin. Because this is nowhere near the year 0 where Jesus was born, or around the year 0 anyway. So we can kind of backfill this history with extra biblical literature, it has been called, this period between the return from the exile and Jesus' coming, that period has sometimes been called the silent period or the quiet period. And that's really not the case. It's not a good name because it's not quiet by any means. A lot of stuff is happening and a lot of writing is also happening. It just so happens that those writings end up not being included in the biblical canon later on. But it's not for lack of people writing tons of things. But what happens in this period is, here we go. Israel comes back out of the exile under Persian rule. And they are allowed to go back. They're allowed to have their local government to a degree. They're allowed to rebuild their cities and their temple, but they're not autonomous. So they're still under Persian rule. However, it's a relatively friendly rule, so they can live with that. Then next we have Greeks who take over from the Persians and beat the Persians and now take over the empire and spread the Greek language and culture everywhere. In there is an episode where when the Greeks come and take over Jerusalem and the temple, the Jews are not at all happy about how they do it because they defile the temple. The general that actually takes Jerusalem walks right into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, which is supposed, nobody is even allowed to go close, right? You're not supposed to go in there. And he goes in there, and everybody expects something to happen. Like, will he fall over dead or something? But nothing happens. So, great concern for the Jews that something's wrong. That is, as a side note, because, the Greeks take over. However, there is a group of Jews that fights back, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But they stand up. They revolt against the Persian rule and actually succeed in freeing Palestine, freeing this area that later becomes Israel, from the Greek rule. And they have a short period of time, about 100 years. The revolt lasts for about 20 years. And then for 80 years after that, they have one dynasty, basically, going on. So for a brief period of time, Israel is actually again autonomous. But it doesn't last very long. And there's a lot of controversy within Israel as well, because while they're autonomous, their leaders seem to be no better than foreign rulers. They seem to be at least as oppressive. And that kind of backfired. And finally, the Romans take over control, and from there on, Israel is no longer... there's no longer a period anywhere where they are autonomous until after the Second World War, so much, much later. So that's in very broad strokes Israel's history, and especially from a political point of view, who was in charge at what time. Now let's focus in to this smaller section of time between the two testaments. This is a phrase that has been coined, the march of the empires. So there's this fast succession of empires, one after the other. It starts with the Assyrians who take away northern Israel, and very narrowly, southern Israel very narrowly escapes. Babylon finishes the job. Then comes Persia, then comes Greece, then comes Rome. And it's just one empire after the other. And this is very much, at least it seems to me, this is where Daniel sits and is like, you know what? Here's a pattern. Here's one power after the other that takes over. And he reflects on that. And if you imagine living in this time, perhaps under the Roman rule, and you know a little bit of history, so you know that in the centuries past, every so often there's a new power taking over that would do something to your identity, especially, again, if you are the small nation that doesn't have that punch, that we can't defend ourselves against Rome or Greece or whoever comes next. then there's an attack on your identity. There's stress on your identity, and especially in those days, land super important. We have a lot of industry today. We have technology. In those days, these are agrarian nations. So survival for a nation very much depends on the land. Do we have any land? And if so, is it good or bad land? But we need some kind of land or else we die. Like without land, we don't exist. So now for periods of time, they had no land. And then even if they get it back, it's not really theirs. They have local governments, but they're not autonomous anymore. So what does that mean? Are we still Israel? Is this still God's promise? Or are we just Greeks now? Are we just Romans? And then there's loss of sanctuary. So the temple was destroyed when they were taken into exile. So huge loss because a lot of the entire sacrificial system was centered around the temple, and now the temple is gone. So what do we do now? We can't sacrifice anymore. So how does this work? And there's different approaches that Hebrews have taken to deal with that, with this struggle to still remain faithful, to still sacrifice in a way, even though there is no temple. And finally, and that I guess that is the third point. The kind of modus operandi became, okay, we got to make sure we obey the Torah. So we got to really make sure we make God happy in some way. Even if we can't sacrifice, well, then we must do this, and we must be even more strict on the Torah. And so the Torah became what kind of the temple was before. The temple was a building. Now this sort of scripture, this book, became the sanctuary. So lots of things happening in a few hundred years. Lots of crisis going on at different times and different kinds of crisis for the people. Now let's see how that has impacted the Jews, because we oftentimes speak about the Jews as the Jews. It's that group of people, but that would be the same as if we would say, the Canadians. Is there such a thing as the Canadians? Are they all the same? Pretty sure among us here we would agree we're not all the same. Or we would say, the Americans, and we know they don't even think they're the same, So the same mistake we make is what we make when we say, the Jews, because they were not all the same. And tonight we will look into a little bit of the differences among different groups among the Jews. First up, perhaps the most well-known ones, the Pharisees. These were middle-class people, but if we should not think middle class as in our middle class. Our middle class is quite mobile. We travel, we have a relatively good life. And those times, middle class is really, those are the laborers. They're not rich people. We would probably consider them to live below a poverty line. But those were by far that was the predominant group of people. And that is the group of people that these Pharisees operated in and came out of. They emphasized a decentralized worship, which makes sense if you consider that there was the exile and they were stripped of the temple and they were stripped of the land. So they very much focused on something. What can we do that doesn't require a temple? Well, I guess we have to worship in our own homes. We have to find some means that is decentralized. So what they then did is they developed the synagogue system. So now we have not just one place of worship that all the Jews would surround, but now we have places of worship in each town, basically. So decentralized in that sense. Much more of a democratic mindset, like whatever the majority says or should be done, that's what we do. And as it happens, this is the largest group, so they would be very happy with that. And their claim to fame is that they developed an expectation of resurrection. So this is one of the groups that was heavily inspired by all this loss and all this tragedy, that they came to expect there's got to be more than this. If God is really a just God, then he will get, he will get even. He make all of this good again. And if we die, if we are being stripped of everything and we die in that sense, how is that just? So, by conclusion, there must be a resurrection. There must be a future time when we will experience justice. So they kind of pioneered this thinking in a way. Then let's look at some images here. So bottom left, that's a synagogue, or what's left over anyway, of a synagogue in Capernaum. On the right, that is a house or a home synagogue. So they would incorporate these synagogues into even in the suburbs, let's say, what we would call suburbs today. So very much a decentralized system. There's not necessarily a specific house or a building for this, but it could be incorporated into somebody's building or dwelling. And then the top left, a Torah Scroll. This is actually how you can buy it from Amazon today. So you have the two scrolls in this protective encasing, and very much decorated, so it's very highly regarded, especially by Pharisees. Then the next group are the Sadducees. You know what? The next time I will ask you if you know these groups actually. So the Sadducees, very much the higher level, the elite class, as much as the Israelites could become elite anyway, but these were the high level people. So they were the priests. And priest sounds very religious. And to an extent, this is true, because they would control the temple. And they very much emphasized, no, we got to go back to the good old days. Now that we have funds, we have rebuilt the temple, this is the way we should do it now. Not the stopgap solution that we had in exile. So very much coming back and pressing on a centralized system. And they would control the temple to a degree, because they're not the majority. If the Pharisees say, oh, you know what, we don't need the temple, then that means a lot of people don't actually go to the temple or don't take it as seriously. At least not as much as the Sadducees would want it to be. Very aristocratic mindset, a hierarchical mindset. We're at the top, you're at the bottom, whatever we say goes, because we're the priests, we're descendants of, most likely the name stems from Zadok, the priest Zadok, which was, I believe, and he is a descendant of Eleazar, who was appointed by Solomon as the high priest for the first temple. So, they claim their heritage, and this is why you should listen to what we say. They also control the Sanhedrin, which is kind of the Jewish equivalent to, let's say, the Supreme Court of Justice. And throughout the Roman Empire, and whichever empire came before, obviously the empire takes over and their laws count. On top of those laws, the Jews would have their own purity laws and all, like the whole Mosaic law. And that's what the Sanhedrin is for. So this was entirely an internal law system. And the Sadducees are the ones policing that. And their claim to fame is an understanding of God as absolutely holy and absolutely separate from the world, almost to a degree where it's not just, he can't cause any evil, but he can't even look on any evil. So he's so holy that the world and everything that is so bad, he is entirely separate from that. So what does that sound a little bit like from what I told you earlier? Yes, very much so. So these people have, at least as it seems, they are endorsing new ideas from the Greeks, and they endorse this separation between the holy and the unholy, the dirty, let's say, and everything. We are all unworthy, but God is so holy that he's not even approachable anymore. We can barely address him unless you come and sacrifice at the temple, right? There's always a reason for everything. So, there's two groups left. Can you remember one, perhaps from Sunday school or whichever education you've taken? Yes. Oh, first some pictures. But yes, that's the next one. So, Sadducees, they're very sad because their temple is destroyed. You probably have seen pictures of that temple model at some way. Maybe you've been even in Jerusalem. But I thought that model doesn't really do it justice in terms of the scale of the thing. So I included that painting in the bottom left, so you can see how massive that whole complex really is. People really look like ants. And this is a picture of what it looks like today. I was actually there in 2019, and these stones protruding here, and this base is this arch. So here would be the rocks. This is the base that we look at here. So it is really that massive. So, Essenes, here we go. Again, very different lifestyle. We could say even below the middle class, but they're kind of beside that hierarchy because they're separate from it. That's their whole point. They're hermits. They want to be left alone, live their own lives. Their worship is secluded, so they think, we gotta be private about this, and God, again, He doesn't want to be involved in the world. Like, the world is wicked. We need to be among ourselves, among the holy people. So they kind of developed this monastery type of worship, even though monastery wasn't really a thing. So they wouldn't have called it that. But it seems like, to me anyways, that the monastic movement a couple hundred years later, the Christian monastic movement, has its inspirations from this lifestyle or from this approach to holiness. And huge emphasis on ritual purity. So we will see that in the pictures here, actually. On the bottom right, we have what's called a mikva, which is a Jewish ritual bath that they would take every so often. Unfortunately, part of that ritual is that the water that's in there cannot be changed. So that is unfortunate. So people would actually get seriously ill from these baths. But they would do that religiously because this is, we got to do these baths, and it's not about the body, it's about the mind that's being cleansed symbolically in that act. So that's that. On the top left, that is the Qumran, what's left over of the Qumran community, and that was the largest one. I'm not sure if it's the only one, but for sure the largest Essene community that we know of. So they're entirely separate from everybody else. It's basically an outpost in the middle of the wilderness. And that drawing is roughly what it could have looked like in its day. And what you see on the top left in that picture there, the blue, that is the Dead Sea. So that's the area that they live in. Very dry, very arid. And the most easily accessible water is salty water, so it's not drinkable water. So it's quite harsh living conditions, but that's where people would leave them alone, and that's what they wanted. Their claim to fame, they had a huge expectation of a messianic king. Some kind of messianic figure would come and would change the conditions such that they wouldn't have to hide anymore. So all the wicked people would be judged and would be wiped off the face of the earth, and they would be finally freed, let's say, of their secludedness. So, yeah, Essenes, a very different mindset. And the last one?
They're a group of the Gnostics or something?
That is what we would go into if we dug deeper into Greek philosophy and overlap with Christianity. Good question, though. This one starts with a Z.
Zealots?
Yes. Oh, here we go. So the Zealots, again, very different. It's almost like this could almost be a personality test, They seem to endorse different kinds of personality. So these are the renegades. These are people that are very much go-getters and very zealous, obviously, about their mindset or their convictions. Interestingly, they in terms of convictions, they line up more so with the Sadducees. Centralized worship, we should go back to the good old days, except they're more radical in terms of, they see themselves as theocratic. So not democratic, not aristocratic. No, God is the only ruler, and we never bow to anybody other than God, which we, I guess, to a degree would applaud. But they take it to the extreme where, we're supposed to be our own nation. We're supposed to be autonomous. And if we're not, well, then that means war. Like, we would rather die than to bow to anybody else. So that makes these people very subversive and very, very much a nuisance to any empire. And that these are basically the people that instigate the revolt against the Greeks, and then later on against the Romans after Jesus' death in the year 70. Basically, the final Jewish revolt, and then the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, and basically the end, let's say, of the Jewish presence in Palestine, at least the dominant presence. So, yeah, very much engaged people. So, and I have some pictures here as well. Most famously, the Zealots, in their last revolt against the Romans, they were winning in the beginning, as long as the Roman military presence was relatively low. But then, as the Romans took notice of this revolt, shipped in more soldiers and more legions, they were vanquished. And their last outpost was on top of this hill, which used to be a palace for Herod the Great, who, in itself, a very interesting character. He kind of liked to ride the balance between Jews and Romans. He liked to please both and kind of get the respect of both. And he endorsed large building projects. He liked to impress the empire. The empire or the emperor that sponsored him. So he built his palace, one of his palaces, he has many, and they're all breathtaking, on top of this mountain. And on the left side there, you can see a reconstruction of what it could have looked like in its stay. And this is, even just the palace itself was mind-boggling, but then its location, this is directly... If you go down the mountain, you go directly into the Dead Sea. So again, the nearest source of water is no good water, and every other source of fresh water is far, far away. And yet, this is where he wants his palace. So powerful man that he gets that going. And there are even reports, who knows if that's true or not, but that he had even his own winery on top of that mountain. So, how do you get wine? How do you get... vines to grow? Well, you need water, and you need people to bring it up there on foot, basically. So large building projects there, and the Zealots took over this palace, and that was their final stronghold until the Romans eventually, after a long siege, succeeded. Although the Zealots kind of kept their word, rather dying than bowing to anybody else. When the Romans actually arrived at the top, everybody was already dead because they had all committed suicide. So, very sad story. And another one is the bottom picture there. That's not the same area. You can see it's very lush. This is in northern Israel. The water you see is the Sea of Galilee. And those mountains in the back are called the Cliffs of Arbo. And those are basically, they're very anomalous geological formations in that area, because most hills there are, like hills, they're rolling hills. Here you have cliffs. And in those cliffs are a ton of caves, and this is also another stronghold that they were hide in. So they hid in these caves. They basically made their own town in these caves, carving it into the mountainside. And according to Josephus, who is a historian of the time, the Romans conquered this area, conquered those cliffs by lowering baskets from the top filled with Roman soldiers who would fire burning arrows into those caves. So again, very gruesome picture. So either, you're backed into a stone wall basically, and, the Roman Empire wins at the end. But yeah, those were the Zealots. So, some more concluding thoughts here regarding these four. We can kind of see that the left side, I will, here's a disclaimer. These are my own observations, my own divisions between these. I do not claim to be a scholar or to, I don't want to say this is exactly how it is, but my personal observation is the people on the left are more concerned about the Torah, or let's say the religion, right religion, versus the people on the right are very much concerned about government. We don't really care so much about, the law as much as we care about our own autonomy. But then there is a difference because, for example, the Sadducees, they're happy to collaborate with the Romans. So they are concerned about government and about centralizing it. They like their power, but they're happy to collaborate with the Romans, versus the Zealots are not at all. And then on the other side, we have a general agreement that yes, the Torah is really important. But then there is a distinction between the Pharisees and Aseans, because the Pharisees think we can still coexist with other people. The Torah is important, but it is important because it is for the people. The law is for the people. Versus the Essenes, who think, no, we are a holy community and we need to be entirely separate from the world so that we stay holy. We remain holy. So thus we kind of get some quadrants here. This is the kind of world that Jesus comes into. So when we speak about, the Jews, it's not one size fits all. We have very different groups. Yes?
So, would actually all the Israelites fit into one of these four groups, or are these just the groups that take the most influence into the Israelites?
That's a very good question. I cannot answer that question, to be honest. I would be inclined to say most Israelites, you're pulled between the different forces. Like everybody's advertising for their party, let's say. And the majority of people would lean towards the Pharisees, but I couldn't tell you how much they would be convinced of that or committed to that cause, apart from the Zealots probably. Like that's probably one where it's either in or out. Like you're either willing to die for it or not. But very good question there.
So, but like for example, if you're in the group of the Sadducees, you're not necessarily a priest or something. You're just in that group that listens to the priests more.
Yes.
Than if you're of the Pharisees group, you're not all of them study the law all the time. They're just more under the influence of these.
Yes.
People.
Yes, that's correct. And but that being said, the Sadducees, like most of their adherents, would be the rich people, because it benefits them if there's centralized power and if they can dictate what kind of sacrifice is allowed and what isn't, because that very much steers an economy around the whole temple, right? And so there is that. It wouldn't be like, Joe Schmo, who is a stonemason somewhere, probably wouldn't have any reason to like the Sadducees. So he would probably tend towards any of the other three.
So they probably have more influence in Jerusalem directly?
Correct. Yeah. So here is this complex picture. And now Jesus comes into this. Now, what do you perhaps foresee happening? If you have four different ideologies, we can call them four parties, because that's very much how they operated. And Jesus comes in there and claims to be this prominent figure, this Messiah. What's going to happen?
I would imagine there's disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
Like some people would think he ends what he says, others wouldn't, or maybe they all disagree or don't agree, but in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
They all now have a common enemy,
Mm.
right? Like Jesus challenges all of them.
Spoiler. Very much like it's that, but it's also like, now think, if there is this guy who gains a following, who gets quite popular pretty quickly, or at least gets a ton of attention, your party probably wants him to be on your side, right? I mean, wouldn't that make sense? If now you have this influential figure today, and we talk about influencers today, you would like them to be of your same party, to support your cause, basically. And if he doesn't, then, disagreements and common enemy. So, that was a much shorter history section today than other days. With that, we will go now into some exercises, let's say, which I think are going to be meaningful. So I'll leave this up here. Now, what I invite you to do is consider the following. Jesus has said a ton of things. Now, some of those things are going to align more with one or the other of these quadrants. And I would like you to discuss in your table groups. I have 4 verses here, 4 things that Jesus has said. You can probably come up with more. But I would like you to discuss a little bit who would approve of which and who would disapprove. Does that make sense? All right. I'll give you, 5-7 minutes or so in your table groups. All right. So, I would like to hear a little bit from each group, just some kind of feedback. Pick one, or whatever conversation was interesting around a certain Bible verse. Who would approve, who would not, for what reason? Is there anything that was interesting that stuck out?
I think what stuck out to me is that, I don't think there'd be any group that would agree with all those 4 statements at all. I think that's part of what we were talking about. It's almost like, So, in that case, it would be what you were saying about, did Jesus stir up, not intentionally, but did it stir up
Right.
a lot of opposition to it? Because he wasn't actually laying down anything that backed up any one particular group.
So lots of opposition and at the same time lots of interest. Because most people would take notice, dang, like this guy does not fit in any of these drawers. So then it's either or, like it's this polarizing character. So it's either I like this or, I'm appalled because it doesn't fit into my... Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, we kind of thought the Essenes would be more agreeable to Morism than the others. But they're not really mentioned too much in the Bible because they weren't Essenes.
Right. Right. I guess the assumption is they would be agreeable just because they don't care. Because it's,
I mean, they seem a little bit on the weak side, maybe, so they'd be okay with that. And they're not, I guess, don't seem self-righteous. So the last 2 probably. The other ones, it's hard to tell.
Right.
Yeah, I think with the Essenes, the first one, it depends whether that statement would actually impact their way of life or not. If it didn't, then I can imagine you just saying, look, just get over it, you're not interested.
That's true.
But if anything in that statement would affect their way of life, then I think they would think differently.
Right. Other tables. I've heard you talk, so. Can we think of people in the Bible, in the New Testament perhaps, that fit into these 4 categories.
I was wondering if John the Baptist would be in the scene.
That is a likely candidate. Yes. So it's not evident in the text. Like he never declares himself like that, but his lifestyle very much fits into that, or there's some parallels. So there's discussion around that. Is he perhaps representative of that of those people?
Would that then mean that he lived in the same communities, or
Possibly.
Or more just kind of like that secluded.
Right. Or yeah, he might not live there, but ascribe to that ideology. But it's also not impossible that he lived there. Like he was a grown man by the time he was killed. So in that time, we don't know exactly.
If the Essenes have the messianic expectation, is it more likely that they would actually think that Jesus is the Messiah? Like, if they have that expectation, would they be kind of the group that was quicker to accept him as he said he was?
That is a good question. That surpasses my knowledge. As far as I remember from my education and things, yes. But I do believe that their understanding of their messianic expectation was also a militant one. But it was more so like, we're not the ones taking over the world, like the Zealots were. We're not the ones freeing ourselves. It's going to be this messianic king that's going to come and do it for us. So in those terms, he would still not quite fit their expectation. And I think that could again be a hint to John the Baptist being a scene, because he preaches that Jesus would come and baptize with water and with fire. And that fire part, I think, is where later on he starts to doubt, Jesus, are you the one you said you would be? But before, when he's in prison and he's not entirely sure, like, Jesus, is the show still on? Like, is this going to happen, or did I miss something, right? And that's very possibly that he was expecting that Jesus would eventually rise up and be this powerful political figure eventually, but he doesn't, right? And then this Essene has to understand, wow, like maybe we were on the wrong branch. So, but this is me speculating.
So where would, just as an aside here, where would say some of the disciples fit in here? Because I can't see, the fishermen. I don't see a particular spot here that they would fit from what we know in the Bible. But is that just because these are the main 4 groups and they would fit into something else? Or
Excellent question. Does anybody have an idea around that?
Well, we talked a little bit about it, and so the way that I would look at it is kind of like political parties, maybe. So you have certain leaders that are influential in certain ways of thinking, and then as a common layman, you always feel drawn to one or the other based on whether you agree with how they view reality and how they think we should react in terms to the Romans. So similar to, conservative and liberal parties these days, they have different ways of approaching reality and how we should deal with government. So in that sense, I think maybe, I know Judas, one of the disciples, is explicitly mentioned that he's a zealot. Like the Bible says, Judas is a zealot. Somebody like Matthew, I would assume he's a Sadducee because he probably was wealthy and he obviously was working with, like he was engaging in government. So even there you can see there's already tension within the disciples.
Right. Yeah, very much. So he mentioned 2 more examples here. We have a zealot. We have a Sadducee, or at least somebody who could align with that, who would profit from that. That only leaves us with the Pharisees.
But that includes like laborers, right?
Yeah.
So that could be just kind of anybody.
Exactly. So in some ways, we could say Jesus came out of the Pharisaic movement. He would be very much born into that culture, because the Sadducees are kind of secluded into Jerusalem. It's like the Bloc Québécois, it's just their separate thing. So I'm not sure if this is appropriate or not, but very much centralized, and and the Pharisees are the only other major party, and they would be the ones that, like, by far the largest number. So Jesus would grow up, and we know that he went and was educated in synagogues, right? So very much he lived a Pharisaic lifestyle. He's called a rabbi. So that all that language is Pharisaic thinking, Pharisaic understanding of Jewish culture. And that's, I think, why the Pharisees have such a beef with him, is that you grew up among us, and why don't you stick to what we told you? Why do you make your own thing? So there's that. So we could say Jesus is a Pharisee. We could probably throw most of his disciples into that and say, or at least they would all have grown up within that environment. Cool. Now I have one more exercise. This one is similar. Again, who would like this? Who wouldn't? But this time it's not what Jesus says, but it is what he does, or what he is in one of the cases. So again, let's take some 5 to 7 minutes, discuss in table groups, and then we reconvene. We agree on which one wins. So, second round, anything that stuck out, anything that was interesting in this context?
Maybe we could start with kind of a wondering that we had is how people would react to Jesus being baptized if we were trying to remember any reactions that were recorded in the Bible. And all we could really remember was that there was some kind of difference between, like, John baptized, like, repentance or something, right? But so that I think we were, like, a little unsure about that one.
Okay. So what did the other people think?
Maybe does anyone remember anybody's reaction in the Bible? Because I feel like I have this thought that somebody or some group was like, well, if you're really God, why would you need to be baptized? Like, why would John baptize you? Does anyone remember something like that?
I think actually John is hesitant in some accounts. John himself is hesitant to do it because of who he thinks Jesus is, right? So.
So who do you think would approve of Jesus' baptism?
I don't know, I guess there's like a confusion of would anyone care?
That's a good question.
Are they neutral? Maybe they'd all just be kind of confused.
Right. I mean, at that point, Jesus' ministry is barely starting, right? So he doesn't have this huge following yet. If his baptism had happened later on, more people would actually take notice and actually realize, okay, here's something going on. What is that? Most likely, the Essenes would clap if they would see this happen. One, because John is possibly an Essene, but also the baptism practice very likely has close ties to the Essenes and their ritual baths. Except this is much nicer because this is running water. But the idea of cleansing oneself from impurity is very much a part still of our understanding of baptism, right? There's a ton of symbolism going on. One of them being, I go in dirty and I come out a new person, right? So there's that overlap with Essene purity mentality. Others probably wouldn't care. Yeah, most likely. How about maybe the third and fourth? So Jesus claiming to be the Messiah and claiming to be of Davidic descent. Would anybody take issue with that?
Jesus identifying as the Messiah, but he wasn't necessarily the Messiah that many people expected.
Mm-hmm.
So I think definitely the Essenes would have probably had an issue with that, because he wasn't this powerful king, that could lead a revolt or whatever. And I think probably the Zealots would have the same sort of feeling. I don't know about the other two.
I think the other two would be quite worried too, with a history of rebellion within Israel. Like, they're the ones working with the Roman government. So now there's another guy claiming to be a Messiah. So they're just expecting the next revolt happening. So they're like, what can we do to quench the fire, right? So I think doesn't one of them actually say better for one man to die than for many of us? Like, and he says that in a sense of like, better we kill this Jesus guy to get rid of the next revolt movement rather than allowing the Romans to have an excuse to come in here again.
Right.
I think that's Ananias.
Yes, it sounds familiar. I think you're right. One thing that what I'm thinking about is along the same lines. The Pharisees and especially the Sadducees could also be worried, just because if it is true that he is a descendant of David and he is indeed the Messiah, that spells the end for especially for the Sadducees, for their ministry, let's say, or for their party, because they're obsolete at that point, right? Or at the very least, now there's a huge challenge to it, because David, definitely, this is a political figure, long dead, but still very much everybody knew, King David. If you're a descendant of King David, and we expect a king of his descent, so now is this the guy? What does that mean? Definitely a threat to the existing power, right? Any other observations, thoughts?
We thought all of them would dislike Jesus making Matthew a disciple.
Yeah. Can you explain that? Why would the Sadducees?
Well, so apart from the Sadducees, all of them would dislike it because Matthew is a tax collector, and
Right.
they're generally dislike it. The Sadducees would see it as one of theirs going over to a Pharisee, because they would probably see Jesus as because he grew up in a Pharisaic tradition, so
Right.
they would see one of theirs switching sides to the Pharisees.
There we go. So that's generally a bad move for PR. and that maybe segues to the concluding thoughts for today. Among Jesus' disciples, we do have, maybe not explicitly, but it appears implicitly, all of these represented from all different corners of whatever. All the different parties that are represented. And they're all invited, they're all part of this same group, and they're kind of forced to live together now and to get along, to figure it out alongside Jesus. And I think that is a challenge for us today, to myself anyway. And perhaps, I don't know if we want to spend time with that particularly, or if not, we can just take this question home. What does it look like for us today? This example of Jesus reaching out into all the different parties, but not aligning with any one of them, not lending himself to any one of them. What implications does that have for us today? Maybe there are some thoughts that want to be shared. If not, we wrap it up.
I think in terms of today, possibly it would stop or it would reduce either the swinging controls or even the extremes, whatever. Perhaps because you're bringing more people, trying to bring more people together.
Mm-hmm.
Is obviously what Jesus was trying to do, but sort of almost showing that everybody's got a place and everybody's got a say.
Right.
I think the exercises highlighted that there are things that to this group for this thing, but not this one. But they said, keep it nice and to this one for that thing, and not this one. And I think for me, it's a good reminder that I have a human brain, so as much as I think that I've got the right quadrant, I've got to figure it out. Chances are I don't. And it's a good challenge. Like, there's things that maybe all of us would probably jointly say, that doesn't seem great. But then there's things that maybe we can't even agree on whether it seems great. And I don't know. I get frustrated that Jesus wouldn't just go ahead and pick the proper quadrant. This is right. But I guess that's, for my brain, always humbling to then try and back up and say, well, that's why I'm not the judge, because I'm a human looking at this. And I can see the places I fall, and who am I to say, yep, that exact spot where I fall, that's right.
I think sometimes we're also tempted in very similar manner than the Jews were in those days. Just again, to assume, I think we're right. I think we got it figured out. And Jesus, or at least, or God, and I guess in their thinking, they're more concerned about God because they weren't sure if Jesus was the Messiah or not. But God has to be on our side, obviously. And I think we're very tempted to do that ourselves as well. And that can be very political as well, just as much as it was in those days. Christians have to vote conservative for X or Y reason. Obviously, there's no other way. If you vote something else, well, you can't be a Christian because you're against this or that, or you're for this or that bad thing. And I think something like this very much challenges this box view, because we cannot box Jesus into, we cannot corner him into any of these categories. He's beyond all of these things, and in all of them at the same time. Well, that concludes my efforts for tonight. We have snacks in the back, so feel free to stick around for a little bit, chat, get to know each other, digest what we just talked about. Other than that, I will take this opportunity to send you again, not to dismiss you, to send you into this week, to share what you have learned and to keep thinking and pondering about these things. And please be encouraged and come back next time. Who's volunteering to pray with us tonight for closing? I guess it's my turn tonight. Let's pray. Dear Father, we thank you so much that you give us freedom, you give us peace, that we can come and we can congregate, we can learn together, we can share what we have learned, we can bounce ideas off of each other, and expect that you are working in all of these things. We expect that your Spirit is present, that you guide us, you guide our thoughts and our hearts, and we ask that you use these days, these times, to mold our hearts, to shape ourselves more and more like you. And today perhaps we have seen that this is a shape that doesn't really fit any human categories, or at least the ones that we tend to fall into. And so we ask you that you help us to grow beyond these categories as well, that you help us to see outside of the boxes that we operate in, and that we allow you to shape our vision and shape our hope for the future as well, that we see it from your perspective and not through a particular vision or a particular version that we ascribe to. And we ask you to also bless the fellowship that we might have now, and keep everybody safe until we see each other again next week. Amen.